So this past week, the Respect for Marriage Act just passed the House Senate and was signed by President Joseph Biden. And there's been a lot of conversations about what this bill means for Christians. And so today on Life Talks, we're going to be discussing this. We've had conversations about social issues before, Dan, but it always seems like there's another one that opens up this can and we get to talk about the implications of what it means for Christians individually, Christian institutions. And so we're having this conversation today. I'm Ben, you're Dan. We are two of the teaching pastors here at Life Fellowship. And it's just another example, Dan, for me, when I hear about it, it's just kind of like, yeah, okay. Yeah. I guess that was my initial thought, but I think
and that's sad, isn't it? Because it used to be, you'd see these things and you say, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
And now we've almost become numb to it.
Yeah.
As the progressive left, which I don't even like to use that term, but, continues to march forward almost unabated right now in their journey toward changing the cultural fabric of our nation.
Yeah, I try to read some articles about it, and some of them, like I read one take from the Heritage Foundation. They thought this was absolutely horrible, and then I read an article on Christianity Today, and they said this isn't too bad because there's protections for Christians, and so
yeah. By the way, of the two, in terms of credibility, I'm going to go with Heritage Foundation over Christianity Today.
Why is that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, because Christianity Today has moved increasingly leftward. They were always more on the left side of center before, and they've grown increasingly left. They have an appeasement, pluralistic type of
There's
mentality.
a little bit of There's a little bit of wokeness.
They keep
CT.
moving that, and some of that wokeness is an overreaction to
Donald Trump,
and
totally.
far right stuff.
I think there is a group of Christians who, because of their disdain for not just Donald Trump, but the religious rights fawning over Donald Trump. I think there's a group of Christians, and I believe they're Christians, that are like, we are the antithesis of that. And so therefore anything that is even whiffs of conservatism, they want to nothing to do
which
with
is, and this is probably a whole other podcast, but that's an incredibly naive position to hold. And because this is a culture war, okay? When you fight war, you understand the rules of war are to win at whatever cost, because the opponent generally wants to annihilate you.
Yeah.
They're assuming that our opponents on this other side are virtuous enough to let us practice our faith unencumbered. And that's just not where they're headed.
That's right.
And that's why this bill ought to be concerning to us to some extent, not simply because the impact of this specific bill, as much as it is another victory, another notch in the belt, so to speak, of the progressive left's battle against traditional biblical morality.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, they've showed their cards in some ways with I always mispronounce it, the Oberfeld
decision.
Yeah, back in 2015. And there's this exchange between Samuel Alito and I can't remember the name of the lawyer that was arguing for the government, but the whole idea was Alito, they showed their cards. They said basically what we're trying to do is take away the tax-exempt status of every institution, college, university that does not believe in gay marriage. I mean, that's their ultimate desire, is to do away with anyone, and it doesn't matter the religious institution. They want to do away with anyone that will disagree with their philosophy of sexual ethics.
Yes, and taking away the tax-exempt status is not the final destination. I mean, it could literally become incarceration of those who would speak against it. The progressive left has not yet plumbed the depths of their commitment to normalizing deviant behavior, and we see it in a lot of places. Legislation is just one of the aspects of it. It's infested the corporate world.
Mhm.
It's infested the entertainment world.
The
It's
educational
infested the
system.
educational system. All the main pillars, even to the point banks now are refusing to do business with people who don't share their sexual ethics.
You're kidding me.
No, absolutely. They are closing the bank accounts of certain organizations that they would consider to be hateful. So you can't disagree in today's culture unless you're automatically labeled hateful.
Mm.
And so now, and this has happened in Europe and in Great Britain, but it's also been attempted here. PayPal has come precariously close to it, and there's probably eventually going to be some litigation on it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you think just protecting the ability to marry, and the other thing about this bill that was brilliant on their part, and it
They
suckered a
added
lot of people.
the
They added
racial racial
yeah.
component to it.
So by impact or by subtle implication, it was like, well, if you're against gay marriage, you're also against interracial marriage.
Yeah.
And they put people in a position where in the next election they would say, yeah, he voted against interracial marriage. So and that's the dirty part of politics.
That's politics. They love to
And both
slip in
sides play
these
that.
these
Yeah, both sides play
amendments that you vote against this,
Yeah,
right?
it's called the poison pill.
Yeah. So, I think the only reason, maybe this isn't the only reason, but a lot of the reasoning for this, what triggered this was actually Clarence Thomas's dissent to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? Because he actually said all of these social decisions that the Supreme Court has made, you need to revisit them. And there's been people that said, that was just his opinion, even though we might think it's a right opinion, right?
But I mean, he was basically sowing the seeds, hoping to gain some traction for it to be revisited. Which, if you are an originalist, if you if you're a strict constructionist, his point is valid.
Yeah,
it isn't the fact of whether gays should or shouldn't be allowed to be married that's the core issue here. It is, does the Constitution require
exactly?
And that's where he says, the Obergefell decision was mistaken. But he goes back to another decision, I can't remember the name of it, 1964 as well, that basically legalized. And he's saying the Constitution isn't talking about this.
Yeah.
So we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
But the left wants the Constitution to be applied in this way, which your activist judges would embrace as well.
Right.
It's a difference in philosophy, and that's fine. That's that's the reason why we have justices and judges and courts. And you have to be able to make your case and make it effectively. But he wasn't wrong in raising the issue. His timing and maybe even the occasion may have not been the wisest, because they can speak at other times to raise these kind of questions. That
was the dog whistle, so to speak, that people were like they freaked out about. And this is what they want to do. They want to overturn all these things. And so and you and I both know that you cannot legislate people into a moral. People say you shouldn't legislate morality. No, you should legislate morality, because your legislation should be a reflection of morals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what they're saying is you cannot legislate someone into morality. That's maybe a better phrase that we could use. And we know that even if you pass all these laws, you're never going to legislate someone into morality. But what I do think is important is to understand that there were amendments that were tried, that were attempted by certain Republicans. I think Mike Lee was the biggest one to add an amendment that really would protect anyone of any religious background from coming under any discrimination or attack, and that his got voted down. There was another one that was added that did pass, but it was more of a it didn't protect every religious institution or group.
So what is emerging here is, which is the more valued freedom? The clear freedom of being able to worship and practice your religion without encumbrance by the government, or to be able to behave sexually any way.
And force that upon people.
And force that upon other people who may disagree with it, which is, there's one that's clear in the Constitution, and there's one that is not even mentioned in the Constitution, but by implication, people are arguing for it. It really has the potential to disrupt 250 years of U.S. history. Simply because either the Constitution matters or it doesn't. And when we decide the Constitution doesn't matter, and that a judge or a set of judges can eliminate broad rights that are clearly enunciated in the document, then you might as well just throw the whole thing out. And
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's really what we're facing right now is, I guess here's a question I want to ask you is, do you think that this law will be taken to the Supreme Court to see if it's...
Yeah, I mean, I suspect some applications of it will be at some point in the future, and I think, considering the current state of our court, that will be okay. You see, again, Congress can pass any bill that they want to, including this one, but if it doesn't meet constitutional muster, then the Supreme Court's just going to knock it right back down. So there are several constitutional issues as to whether the United States Congress has the right to impose the will of the federal government on individual states as it regards to what marriages they're going to accept or not. We know that probably of the 50 states, there's probably going to be about 30 of them not going to have any problem with this at all.
Right.
But there are a few southern states and western, Midwest, upper Midwest states that may have some problems with this. And so as a result, I think somebody's probably going to challenge this, just like ultimately the reason Roe versus Wade was challenged.
Yeah.
But that'll take years and years and years to process.
Yeah. So there's two other issues I want to bring up to you that I was thinking about, and I just want to ask your take on it. The first one is this. Section 7 of the law talks about that this does not apply, their law does not apply to polygamous marriages. Okay? So it's only same-sex marriages. But my question is this, why? Like, on what basis are they even limiting... You know, if marriage is not between a man and a woman, it can be between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. That they've removed all boundary. Like, they just drew a line in the sand that's just a little bit, I guess, to the left. Yeah. But there's once you've untethered the definition from the true anchor of what it has been for millennia across the known civilization. Why? If I was a polygamist right now,
I'd be ticked.
I would be suing. Like, I'd be suing and saying, you can't. Like,
this is discrimination.
This is discrimination, right? Because you've already...
There's more of a record, by the way, of the recognition of polygamous marriages than there is of homosexual marriages. that's historically.
Good. But I guess that's my question is, what... They don't have any basis to make that standard. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for us not to overlook, because it's part of an agenda. I mean, this is the dismantling of traditional Judeo-Christian, moral, biblical Christian worldview, however you want to apply it, values, is the agenda of the radical left. It is where they're going. When I was a kid, you would never have had this conversation. And then it just became a part of the, well, what ifs? And then all of a sudden, here's a state, there's a state. And then, so 50 years removed from my childhood, this is now the law of the land. So you got to ask yourself, what other conversations are occurring at this moment that 50 years removed from now, long after I'm dead and gone, but after my children are my age, are going to be? Here's the ones they're talking about now. They're talking about MAPS, minor attracted people. Are they being discriminated against? You can be a minor attracted person, which, by the way, is a fancy dancy word for pedophile.
I mean, that it makes me nauseous to even think. But that's exactly the same.
But if we had this conversation 50 years ago, we were talking about drag queens and transvestites. The person I was talking to would have said, that even makes me nauseous thinking about it. And so what happens is we normalize deviant behavior. And the word deviant is even a bad word, but deviant means away from the normal or away from, the common. And so these are deviant sexual behaviors. And now we've normalized them. And then we're going to get to a point where we prefer them. We must celebrate them. We can't even just tolerate them. We have to celebrate them. And then if you oppose them, you're guilty of hatred. And because of the rise of hate laws, that becomes, again, we started this trend back in the 80s and 90s when we started defining hate speech. Look, we have freedom of speech. We have freedom to be hateful. We have freedom to be obnoxious. We have freedom to be wrong or stupid and to speak of that. Or we don't have freedom of speech. But there's no and somebody always say, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded building. But we're not talking about that. When they gave the new category of hate crimes, in order to do that, you've got to go to motive and intent and in areas of a person's life that are very abstract.
Right.
And at the bottom line, murder is always murder.
Right.
You know, if you
Right.
take care of it because it was murder, whether they were hateful about the murder or it was specifically because of a person's skin or sexual orientation or whatever, is irrelevant. Deal with the murder. But if this becomes an added bludgeon to the penalty. So we are in a position now where normalcy is offensive, which is, you know, the traditional values, the sexual ethics and so forth we've discussed, and deviancy is preferred. So therefore, I'm hateful if I say, you're not going to use my tax dollars to bring some flippant drama queen, but a drag queen into my kids' elementary school to read to them. There are 9,999 other categories of people that can read to my kids I don't have a problem with. Don't you dare bring that in. And don't you dare do that without my knowledge either.
Yeah.
So that I can walk in there and pull my kid out of that school. And by the way, any self-respecting parent would do that.
Yeah.
If you would let your kid sit at the feet of a deviant drag transvestite reading funny little stories to your kids about how this is somehow normal, you're a bad parent.
Yeah.
I'm that clear. You're a bad parent. So we parents have to get back in there and start exercising. You say, yeah, that sounds so radical. It ought to be radical to protect our kids.
Yeah,
And
I mean, the soul of the next generation is really
it's a
what's
stake
at stake right now.
Yeah, but like the proverbial frog in the kettle, which we know isn't true, what we have done is like, oh, well, you know, I don't want my kid to be ostracized. I don't want to have a problem with the teacher. And we rationalize inaction. And in doing so, we're destroying our kids. Our
Yeah.
kids are growing up so confused. And we're seeing it in middle school, tween age kids. They don't think it's wrong to have a homosexual relationship. They don't think it's wrong
Switch genders.
to switch genders. They don't think
Yeah.
it's wrong. And now when these kids grow up and they learn hardened values, the right and wrong and normalcy and deviancy, they're horrified that no parents, no authorities stood up for their protection during the vulnerable ages when they were susceptible to these kind of lies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's what you just talked about. That was a beautiful rant, Dan.
I was in full rant mode, wasn't I?
I think that we really have to, as parents, understand what is at stake. And I think there's this, what my heart wants to do is we just have to learn how to cry out to God. And we have to learn how to say, God, you are the only one that can change the trajectory of all of these things happening. Yes, the left has an agenda. It feels like the left has power. And this is one of the things we've been talking about in our Daniel series. But at the same time, like, I've got to believe that God's more powerful than this. And I don't want to lose hope and I don't want to get discouraged, but it's like that's where my heart kind of sometimes defaults into when I read about this. It makes me concerned because all they're like you said, it's one more step to make normal that which is not normal. And I think in what has transpired in 20 years, right? I can't remember I think Massachusetts was the first state to pass civil unions for homosexuals in 2003. I might be mistaken on the year, but it was around that time, right? And look where we have come in 20 years.
Yeah. But I would also point out a book written in the 1980s by Robert Bork, who should have been on the Supreme Court. And the title of his book was Slouching Toward Gomorrah. Now, that book is 40 years old, 50 years old now, 40 years old. And Bork is dead. Go back and read that book, and it's like reading a book of prophecy. And he was alarmed at that stage, but what he predicted would happen is now unfolding, and that's why we can't live in the moment on these things. We have to see where it's headed,
right?
And it's an unrelenting shift away from God. It's as old as the fall of man, and we're called to resist it. We're called to offer the different. But the other thing I think conservative Christians need to be really aware of is our tendency to place our hope in government protection.
Yeah.
That's gone and it's never coming back.
And I guess that's the one question I said I had two things to ask you. One was the polygamy thing. The other thing was as Christians, what do we do with this? I mean, how do we respond? How do we, in the last few moments that we have together, what kind of advice or encouragement would you give to a Christian who, it's not going to change. It doesn't change our life. Like this doesn't show up on Main Street overnight. but this does do something, and we've
Yeah.
got to respond in the right biblical way. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a multifaceted situation. I think, first of all, we have to go to war. And, people, you say, "Oh, you sound so radical." No, I'm talking about war against evil, war against influences, spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
Um, there are practical steps. I mean, this isn't a rant, but this is very declarative, and some people will disagree. But if I were, 25 and had little kids in my house again, number one, they would not go to a public school. Number two, their access to the internet and electronic devices would be very, very limited and very controlled. Number three, I would be spending so much time with them as the parent, trying to walk with them. Number four, activity in the faith community would be a priority of everything else, including sports and dance and all the other things. I would never, and listen carefully to me on this, I would never skip church to play ball. I would never skip church to do a dance recital. I would never skip church to do these kinds of things, because you're sending a signal. You say, well, that just sounds so legalistic. At some point, it's structuralistic. And by giving your kids a structure of proper values, you are setting the standard for them to be able to decide right and wrong. There's no guarantee that they'll choose that as an adult.
Yeah.
But at least you're giving them a framework from which to make these decisions.
Yeah.
So those are just a handful. I've got a bunch more
That's good.
that I'll probably share at some point again in the future. But it's time for parents to get really serious about the job of leading their family and protecting their family.
Yeah.
Because you can't count on society, culture, or government to do one bit of assistance to you in these areas.
Absolutely. I think that's vigilance, awareness.
And vigilance is not vigilantism.
No.
But that's what the world wants you to think.
Yeah.
They want you to think you're radical. They want you to think you're hateful. No, vigilance is a great value of watchful awareness and proactive action.
Yeah, because all of the institutions we talked about at the top end of this episode, you cannot trust them. You cannot trust a television channel or network. You cannot trust a school. You cannot trust.
In some cases, you cannot even trust your church, because even like we started off talking about the Christianity Today, there are loud voices that were wrapped in spiritual titles that are acquiescing. Just like there have been in every religious movement ever, as it declines.
100%.
So we need to know the Word of God ourselves. And fathers, you're that role model in the home, and mothers, you're that voice of the Holy Spirit that has to set the tone. It begins not in Washington. It doesn't even begin at the church. It begins at home. Yeah.
Amen. Well, I hope this has been an enlightening and maybe eye-opening episode for you as you listen to this, to pay attention to what's happening. I know that it's a lot of times when we listen to these laws that are passed, we look at them through the social lens or maybe through a political lens, but really through the spiritual lens is where we need to be always looking first and foremost. Thanks again for joining us today on Life Talks. We look forward to having you join us for another episode